Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank everyone that's attending another FMRI webinar. I would like to thank the IT FAU chapter that they put this webinar together, and it's also an honor to introduce the speaker for today, Mr. Charles Edwards. Charles has a great experience in freight transportation. He used to hold the director of the freight planning office in North Carolina DOT, and he is also the advisory board member from the Freight Mobility Research Institute. Charles has over 50 years of operational and management experience in all four modes of freight transportation. His worldwide career has included significant work in various countries such as Canada, United States, Bermuda, England, Germany, Dubai, and Thailand. He was a member of the team which started for all cargo airlines, including UPS Airlines, and has managed a commercial airport, led a team which designed and built the world's largest air vehicle, and introduced the first composite package container to airlines. He holds degrees from universities in Canada, England, and the United States. He has inducted into the Sigma Chi Mu 2 Supply Chains Honor Society in 2019, and he is adjunct professor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I had the privilege to work with Charles in various projects, and also I had the privilege to work with Charles on different activities through the TRB freight committees. Charles, thank you that you participate today.
Okay, thank you, Evangelos, and thank you to everybody who has come late to this lecture. I'm really glad I'm not a student that has not only beginning at 7, but having to last till 10 at night. I don't know. That's way too late for me. Anyway, so it's a pleasure to make this presentation. And this presentation is done from the perspective of a freight dog, and I am very proud to be known as a freight dog. That's someone who has many years of experience, as Evangelos mentioned, about 50 years in all of the modes. So that is the perspective from which I am going to make this presentation. So we've seen this picture many, many times. This is of San Pedro Bay off ports of LA and Long Beach, but it is replicated at almost all of the ports around the United States, with the exception of the ports in the Great Lakes. But what does that really mean? It means this. At the peak, there was about $30 billion at retail level of goods that were trapped on ships. And we'll get into some of the products that were trapped, some of the products that are still trapped, and what does that mean for the economy of the United States. I have to tell everybody that in my 50 plus years being a logistician, being in freight transport, I have never seen such a categorical meltdown of supply chains. And as was mentioned, I've worked around the world as we are witnessing right now. And quite frankly, talking to people, we don't think that we're ever going to get out of it totally. And hopefully we will get to a moderate level of disruption maybe in about a year and a half from now. So this is going to be with us for a while. As I tell my students at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, why is freight important? Well, without freight, we would be hungry, we would be homeless, and we would be naked. And so freight is absolutely essential to our lives, always has been and always will be. And now it the term supply chain has come into the common lexicon. But what does that also mean? This is a view of trucks trying to get into the gate, one of the gates at the port of LA. But it's more than just the mayhem of the trucks jostling for positions. It's also creating adverse impacts to the environment, including there's a noted rise in cancers, asthma in the vicinity of the ports, in part due to the idling of the trucks as they wait to move. There's financial impacts, which I'm going to get into, and of course, there's the operational impacts, which you see at various stores, whether it's a Walgreens, a Publix, a Harris Teeter, whatever, of empty shelves. It all comes down to this. We either as individuals or on behalf of companies, if we're in purchasing, are placing orders more and more online. What we have identified is anticipatory orders. There is a system within the Amazon system, they've actually patented this, that when you hover over an item, even if you do not select that item, the algorithm says there might be potentially an order for that item, whatever it is, and they apply certain rules and policies to that. But eventually, if there's enough hovering over an item, it generates an order to a supplier. And that is adding to the volume over and above what we all are buying. And our purchasing demand is way up in the United States anyway, but that's adding to the volume, which is great for the manufacturers, typically in Asia, but not exclusively, which is loading up the ships, and that's clogging up the entire supply chain. And it goes from the warehouses all the way back to the point of manufacture. Warehouses are full. That means containers can't be offloaded. They're left on chassis, and it's just a snowball effect. We tend to look at the problem at the ports, but they're only just one of the many, many choke points in the entire supply chain. This is a situation that has emerged, but it has its roots in a variety of different factors that have been around for many, many years. In fact, it even predates the 2018-2019 U.S. negotiations with China, which still have not been resolved and probably never will be resolved. We will never go back to the way we were before. But what it's leading up to is a trade deficit, in part because of all of the demand for goods by both Americans and businesses here in the United States. In fact, yesterday, the data was released saying that we have hit in the United States the largest trade deficit ever. It grew by 27%. I'm just going to read the numbers over and above 2020 to $859.1 billion versus the $676.7 billion, which was in 2020. That number is equivalent to 3.7% of the nation's GDP. So we're demanding a whole lot. We're buying a lot. We're anticipating we're going to sell a lot when it comes to suppliers. And as a result, we have a problem. And I'll get to some solutions that I propose should be taken into account. Whether or not they are, it's beyond my pay grade. In addition to this, we have mountains of empty containers. I was shown a picture recently outside a distribution center in Nevada, empty containers on trailers stretching onto the horizon. There's not enough truckers to even move the empty containers back to the ports where they can be loaded with exports, which could start to, but will never eliminate the the trade imbalance that we have right now with the rest of the world. This is just another picture again. This is probably close to the peak of the debacle. I'm gonna use that term of the supply chain environment here in the United States. All of the green dots, the circles, those are ships that are at anchor. The other ones, you can see where the ships are headed in and around San Pedro Bay. At the worst point, there were approximately 90 vessels lying off LA Long Beach. At the same time, on the East Coast, at the single largest port on the East Coast, Savannah, a single terminal port, there were 35 vessels at the max, and I think it may have gone up a little bit above that. And it's still about the same amount. So steamship companies are not calling Savannah on the East Coast. If they don't have to go there, they're calling Charleston, they're calling ports down in Florida, they're calling Wilmington, North Carolina, and up and down the East Coast because they just can't take the delays. And that's adding to the tsunami of product that is still sitting on wharves in Asia and also in Europe, for that matter, destined for the United States. The value of the goods, this just shows what had happened during last year, January through November. Quick calculation, the average value of the goods in the containers is roughly $40,000. Of course, that varies considering what the commodity is. So this is a significant impact on order to cash for a variety of companies, especially if they've already paid for the goods that are on the containers which are on the ships. They're bleeding cash, and I'll show you the costs just from a financial and interest cost impact to all of these delays. It's just taking longer. This is through December of last year. There has been some indication that this has begun to moderate, that the time, the dwell time or the total elapsed time from loading until discharge and maybe getting out of the port, but not necessarily, is getting a little bit better. But that's catch as catch can, and it fluctuates up and down with significant standards of deviation all around the curve. Additional impacts, additional factors that we're having to deal with. I've already mentioned about distribution centers and warehouses at or above capacity. I know one company, which is the 11th largest U.S. firm that imports goods, so the 11th largest importer. They're trying to find distribution centers and warehouses to store the goods. And they are also saying, whereas before it was 45 days to get a container that's been discharged, that has been cleared, but is sitting in the yard on the port at LA Long Beach, it used to be 45 days, and it's now well above 50 days. And on the East Coast, just as an example, Baltimore, which is a relatively small port, it's 14 days to get anything off the port out of the gate. There's not enough truck drivers. We know about that problem. So there's not even enough drays. And the drivers that are around are getting poached for, well, the price per dray or the fee that the drivers are getting, of course, is going up, but they're moving around. And so a company that's committed to provide the drayage doesn't necessarily have the drivers, even if they have the trucks and the tractors to pull the chassis and the containers. From a financial perspective, this is causing a lot of distress for a lot of companies, especially smaller companies. They cannot afford the additional financial costs reflected in the interest rates that they have to pay. Again, especially if they bought the goods, but they haven't received the cash from the sale of the goods yet. because they don't have control of the product, either in their own warehouse or to their final consumer. And so companies are either taking advantage or having to charge higher demurrage rates. And this chart just shows the increase in demurrage rates by the leading Class 1 railroads here in North America. As you can see, it ranges anywhere from almost nothing in the case of KCS, which of course, as most of you know, has just been bought by Canadian Pacific Railroads, up to eye-watering levels of $500 a day by BNSF and by CSX. I know of one railroad that is refusing to accept containers at their inland ports because they A, don't have the space, and B, they can't even collect the money because in some cases the importers don't have the cash to pay the bills. And so what's going to happen with the product inside those containers? Another impact on all of this is the rising charge for containers. And this is, as many of you will know, on the Shanghai or China runs into LA Long Beach, on those loops, we saw container rates climb from roughly $3,500 to $4,000 for a 40-footer prior to the pandemic. They went up as high as the low 20s for a while. They have since moderated down to the 15,000 range since then. And of course, going to the East Coast is a little bit higher because of the length of haul. But what does that mean to the ability of companies to even make a profit on the sales? And I've highlighted assembled furniture. Here in North Carolina, when I moved here in the early 80s, there were three primary industry groups, and they were tobacco, textiles, and furniture. And we made a significant proportion of the furniture that was consumed throughout the United States. Most of that was sent offshore for a variety of reasons. If the goods are brought back, and this is again as of October, so there's been a slight moderation in the transportation cost. There is no way that the importer can make any money. Basically, when something is sold at retail, that same good has a price differential over the wholesale of double. So if the good is $1 at retail, it's 50 cents out of wholesale. And out of the wholesale price, you have to pay for all of the logistics and all of the transportation. And there's a rule of thumb that most industries use that says, I'm not going to spend more than 7% of my wholesale price on all of the transportation and logistics costs. And if you look at what's happening with assembled furniture, to have to pay 84% of the total retail value just in transportation, there is no way that you could ever make any money. And so there's a line of thought that is starting to emerge that this alone may force companies to reshore or nearshore. I'm aware of one North Carolina company that's looking at nearshoring all of what they used to have made in China, but it's not coming to the United States for a variety of reasons, but they're just going to have to pull out of China because they can't not afford these types of freight rates. And they don't see it moderating in the near future, and they can't afford to wait. So they're starting to withdraw from China as fast as they can. What else is happening? So suppliers are getting these orders, quote unquote, but not based on necessarily real orders, and they're looking forward to fulfill them, but that's only jamming up the entire supply chain. And this goes whether it is Marine, which we see a lot of pictures of, but it's also air cargo. The rates have gone through the roof. We're seeing unbelievable traffic on the Silk Rail links from China into Europe, in addition to the vessels which are also working the loops between China and Europe. And then domestically, we're just seeing an overload of movements. On Thanksgiving Day, I happened to be driving over to our son's house. The only trucks on the road were, guess who? Amazon, one after the other. This was not a holiday for Amazon drivers. Thanksgiving Day was a full-on, full-day work because they were just trying to move product from, in this case, a fulfillment center to a distribution center in Raleigh from their big cluster down in Charlotte. It's also creating delays for truck repairs. So if a truck goes down for whatever reason, guess what? The parts that they need to repair the truck are sitting in a container, maybe on a vessel, maybe in a container yard. And as a result, we're seeing especially independent drivers quitting and going into other trades, primarily in construction because there's a lot of demand. So that only further adds to the lack of capacity to move the goods when we need them. Precision scheduled railroading was a great idea. It created a lot of upset. It was a concept developed by the late Hunter Harrison, who proved it out at Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railroads, two of the most efficient Class 1s in North America. The problem is, if you look at their route network as opposed to the East Coast railroads, they're totally different. And when he brought it to CSX, it created an unbelievable amount of upset. People were laid off, equipment was put into long-term storage. And so as a result, even though Mr. Foote, who's the president CEO, reversed many of the things that Hunter brought to bear at CSX, and all of the other Class 1s followed along as well, we still are dealing with insufficient capacity. And we have this tsunami of trade. And then I've already mentioned the environmental impacts. There's studies already being done and have been done on the I-710 corridor in LA, which links the ports on San Pedro Bay up to Compton, which is about 15, 20 miles away, where most of the rail yards are for UP and for BNSF, and also significant clusters of distribution centers. And they're seeing spikes in cancers and asthma and a variety of other maladies for people that live along that corridor. So there's a wide variety of socioeconomic impacts resulting from this absolute meltdown of the supply chain network and operation here in the United States. And we're not alone. It's happening in Canada, it's happening in Europe, but of course, ours gets most of the press, at least the local press. In addition, e-commerce is another issue. I'm actually doing research at UNC-Chapel Hill on this issue, which many communities are either unwilling or unable to comprehend what's going to happen. And so that first table is a reflection of expected changes in market share. But you can see the increase in the number of truck operations in the next 6 years, or even less, because that was based on 2020. So it's coming. And what does that mean? What is going to be the reaction of county councils or city councils to this? And are city planners prepared for this type of and level of activity? There are cities and towns I'm aware of that are eliminating truck parking provisions in their communities and replacing them with bike lanes. Well, people still want their Amazon package. So what are they going to do? Where is the UPS driver going to park? Or will he always be cited and have to pay a fine because all he's trying to do is, or she is trying to do is to stop the vehicle deliver the package which has been ordered by the resident or by the business or whatever. The ocean costs are increasing. You saw the previous chart. What does that mean? It means inflation is definitely coming, and it's probably going to get worse. The price of goods have to go up because the companies cannot afford to eat these higher transport costs, interest costs, demurrage costs, detention costs, all of these logistics costs, which used to be reasonably manageable, are, for a variety of reasons, out of control. And then the last three pictures show the development of a distribution cluster. It's in Indiana. And what happens there? Well, land gets used, those buildings get filled, they do create jobs, but that also means more congestion on the local roads. And in some cases, or in most cases, based on my experience with NCDOT, it takes from the time you know you need to build a road 10 years before you can actually build the road. And of course, in the interim, the costs of building or widening or whatever, expanding the facility, they go up precipitously. Another issue that we don't have a quick solution for, but it's going to cost us. So what do? We've got to manage expectations. We individually and companies need to manage the expectations. Is that a real sale? Or are we just trying to gain market share? Well, that market share may come back to bite us, or the cost may come back to bite us because the sale didn't materialize, yet we ordered the goods. Returns is another major issue, especially as we've gone to e-commerce. In some instances, the rate of return, the percentage of goods that are purchased which are quote unquote returned, can be as high as 30+%. But there's no real system to accept those returns and to manage the returns and to handle the returns. There was a story on BBC World last week or the week before that showed a part of a desert in Chile, which is covered in clothes that were returned here in the United States. They're of little value. There's no attempt to resell them. And so they're now distributed all over a desert in Chile, illegally, but they're there. And I have seen similar mounds of goods in Africa in various countries where I've worked in the past. There's the old saying of buy local. There's a day typically in November where an American Express helped start this. There is a push to buy at local stores. Well, I believe that unless this meltdown is fixed in a reasonable amount of time, that companies are going to really start looking at make local as well. But are we ready for that? Do we have the buildings? No. Do we have the trained people? No. They're relatively, if you can attract them, they can be trained relatively quickly. Do we have all of the equipment? Do we have all of the infrastructure? And the answers to all of these are either no or we're not really ready. So what can we really accommodate this potential interest in coming back to the United States? Another thing, and especially precision scheduled railroading was a great example of this. There was a push to respond to investor expectations and demands. Well, that's all well and good, and we cannot discount it. And there's no either or, there's no one way is right and the other way is wrong approach to this. But we really need to be thinking about the consumers. And we really need to, in this country, and we're deficient on this as compared especially to Europe and increasingly in Asia and India, we do not understand who the beneficial cargo owners are. And everybody on this call is a BCO, is a beneficial cargo owner, especially if you order anything online. You dictate what you want, where you want it, when you want it, and how you're going to pay for it. You own the good. And increasingly, this is also happening in business-to-business transactions. But many transportation companies are still using the old terms of shipper and consignee. In the real world, that's wrong, because most companies, especially the BCOs, do not consider themselves as either a shipper or a consignee. That's a function. But in reality, it's who owns the freight, who is going to benefit from the sale of the freight. And it may be somebody who never sees the freight themselves. From a planning perspective, which is a space that I'm in a lot, we still don't have in the United States, and for that matter in most countries in the world, a real coordination between infrastructure planning, investment, and what happens on the infrastructure network. So we're trying to anticipate as planners what might happen, and we use outdated information like FAF5, which just came out, which is still based on old data. Whereas other countries, and I'll give an example of the one I'm from, where I was born, Canada, their freight data is 60 days old. Our freight data that we rely on for planning can be a year to 2 years old, and that just has to stop. And there's the technology is out there. There's a variety of resources, whether it's ATRI data, whether it's HERE data, INRIX data, whatever. We just have to get smart about the type of data we use to make sure that our decisions about infrastructure planning are more up to date. We've got to be better throughout the United States at training people, educating people, informing people about the opportunities in either the transportation, distribution, and logistics area or in the general supply chain management. There's a lot of good programs, both at community college level, even some at high school level, especially in South Carolina and North Carolina. And there's probably other ones, but I'm just not aware of, as well as four-year universities. Again, we're not providing what I believe, the information that people need to make informed decisions. And digital investment. Again, the United States is woefully behind. We're 30 years behind India and Europe, both in the marine and the air side. We have the capacity, but we have not adopted for a variety of reasons, which are no longer justifiable, to share information in open access, highly encrypted platforms. It already exists. Only one airport in the United States, Atlanta, has put their toe in the water on this. No other airport has done it. I'm not even aware of any of the ocean ports, maritime ports here in the United States that have made this approach. Yet if you go to Europe, you go to India, you go to Asia, they're already doing this as a matter of course. So for those of you who are interested in developing research, and this is sort of a plug, I am the chair, the committee research chair for a TRB committee that Evangelos and I sit on. These are the types of research areas which I believe we need to pursue. Databases, what's out there, how are they deficient, are there better ones, but what's involved in bringing those quote unquote potentially better ones into full play, into full use. Digitalization, I've just mentioned that. There's many opportunities for applications within the marine and the air industry. There's a lot of reluctance, but how do you educate partners, stakeholders within those industries that this is the way they have to go? And beneficial cargo owners expect this. This is not a nice to have. This is I want it tomorrow morning. And also, quite frankly, both does the CBP, Customs and Border Protection here in the United States, they were already signed on, as well as in Canada, the Customs Border Services Agency have also signed on. So they're expecting anybody that's in international trade to be on these platforms, and yet most companies are refusing. They want to use their old legacy systems. They don't want to share data, and that is just antediluvian. Critical urban and critical rural freight corridors. This came out of the FAST Act that was signed by President Obama back in 2015. It has been re-energized in the IIJA Act that was signed in November of last year by President Biden. But do we really understand the impacts, the benefits, and the costs associated with this? I will tell you that the lane miles that are funded, quote unquote, or subject to potential funding by the feds is ridiculously under the number of miles that need to be funded. Each state gets 300 of each category. And I can tell you, even in North Carolina, because I worked on the first program, we identified 3,000 miles. I can expect in Florida it would be that or even more. Electrical vehicles. Yes, there's lots of benefits, but do we really understand what those are? Do we understand what the costs are? Do we understand what the real timing is? There was a statement that came out recently, a report that said there could be 140,000 of these vehicles throughout the United States, with the primary centers being in California and Texas. But are the rest of the states ready for this? Are the ports ready for these types of vehicles? I don't know. TIMS, which is the Transportation Information Management Systems that most states have, are they really coordinated with, or can they share information with the digital platforms that I have previously talked about? And then finally, AI. I think there's a lot of potential in using artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms that can take away the routine requirements, management, oversight, whatever, of a freight transportation system, and allow human beings who are more adept at dealing with out of spec operations to look at problems, identify root causes, and to come up with solutions. And with that, I'm done. Other than to say I've never seen such a collapse of the supply chain in my life. And I fear for the inability of people to really get together to address the root causes, to come up with solutions which we all need. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that anybody might have. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards, for your presentation. Now, if we have any questions from the audience, you can either unmute yourself or you can type them in the chat and I will address them. So far, I don't see any questions in the chat.
Did I put everybody to sleep?
No,
I
no.
don't think so.
No, but I thought it was really interesting that you said the U.S. like data for like city planning and transportation is like a year or two behind, and Canada's is only like 60.
Yep. Yeah, the Canadian Transport Canada had a law passed a number of years ago which said if you want us to monitor, you have to understand that funding is totally different between Canada and the United States. Provinces, what we call states here, have a lot more power, both from a taxation perspective and also a funding perspective. But Transport Canada provides an oversight and an overview and some funding, especially on national corridors. And what the folks at Transport Canada said to Parliament was, if you want us to accurately and realistically assess the value of these projects, we need to have access to as current data as possible. And so a special act was passed in Parliament a number of years ago. There was a lot of negotiation with transport companies, primarily the rail and the trucking companies, but also the airlines. And they now get data within 60 days of the event, as opposed to our data collection process which has not changed very much in the, I don't know how many decades it's been in existence. And some of the data that we rely on can be a year plus old. That just has to change.
So, Charles, I have a question.
Mhm.
Do you think that all this supply chain disruption is going to be fixed soon, or takes time to go back to pre-COVID time, pre-COVID era? What do you think?
Okay, one, I don't think we'll ever go back to pre-COVID because there's been so many significant changes in how we order goods, our expectations, in part generated by companies that are trying to steal a march on other companies to capture market share. I think if one looks at the volume of traffic that is in either congested ports, at container stations scattered throughout the United States, not being able to move because there is no room in the inn. The warehouses, the distribution centers are overflowing. Forget the Amazons, they know how to move goods. But for many other companies, there's no place to de-stuff, to strip the containers and put them on racks in a warehouse. And so they're sitting on chassis or they're sitting on the ground and they are not even being worked. And until you can get the flow starting to move with some form of regularity, which in talking to some companies, they're going a minimum of 9 months from now, a minimum of 9 months. And we still have ships that are calling the ports and planes that are coming in from throughout the rest of the world. I don't see how we can break this logjam for at least a year. And then it's going to take time after that to really work through and clean and scrub the system. So this is going to be around for quite a while. If you've got money and you've got land and you want to put up a warehouse, you could probably put it up today, or even announce you're going to put it up today and already have it sold. I mean, there are companies that are that desperate looking for space.
Here in Florida, major companies, they built the last year major warehouses with it's called like a smart, with all the smart technologies.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I heard is something similar to your point, the previous comment, is you have money, build the warehouses, because these companies, they don't own the warehouses, they are leasing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
they are leasing. So there are many investors here in Florida from different states that they are buying old warehouses, tearing down and build new ones with all the modern technologies for inside the warehouse or outside warehouse.
Right.
And it's amazing. It's amazing that it has been changed. The entire freight transportation. Before COVID, the freight delivery trucks, they were working weekdays.
Mm-hmm.
Now they are working 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
24/7, and the demand is so high that they are leasing cars, leasing regular cars, and pay drivers like kind of Uber or Lyft
Mm-hmm.
to deliver products. The other interesting thing is they have done this research before, but they're discussing more now how the public transportation will help with the logistics. Right. and freight. I think, Vasquia, we have some questions on the chat.
Yes, we have. So I will start with the first one. It's from Dave, and he says that some states and even Congress are talking about dropping HTF tax collections or local gas taxes, even with unmet needs and IIJA authorized, but only fractionally funded. Please let us know your opinion on that.
So I'd not heard of this. So states are not collecting gas taxes?
Are talking about dropping HTF tax collections or local gas taxes.
I had not heard about that. I do know, at least I can only speak for North Carolina, that there is a big concern about generating tax revenues because we still have to build the roads, we still have to maintain the roads, we still have to add capacity in the road network. That's not going away, and road haulage accounts for about 78 to 82% of all freight movements on average here in the United States. The rest rail and marine and air. But I had not heard of this proposal. At some point, if you don't collect the money that you need in order to even maintain the roads, and we saw this happen in the 1980s in New York, where they didn't maintain the subway system and it all but cratered on it. They spent a lot of money trying to get the equipment back in order and the rails and all of that stuff, the signal system. I'm not sure how smart such a decision is because the need doesn't go away. It only is going to get worse. But again, I'm not a financial expert, so I'd be interested to see what their real thoughts are on that.
I got a quick question too. You mentioned that they're talking about having 150,000 electric vehicles on the roads, most of them being in California and Texas.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think, especially in Texas, you see all the issues with their power grids over in Austin and whatnot? They can't even handle the homes. They can't generate enough power for homes. How do you think? You think we have the grids to keep up with all these electric vehicles? Especially with all these like green sustainable energies and
yeah, it's great to have the equipment. What are you going to plug them into, and how reliable is that source? And so it's one thing to build the equipment. I know that Tesla and I think it was Toyota has just announced that they're really looking at developing the charging stations, but then what do you plug the charging stations into? There are some states which have very robust grids. The political environment in Texas is very unique in how they manage and control electrical distribution and production. And I do know that they are starting to address some of the deficiencies which were brought out after the last ice storm and snowstorm, which I guess was really last year, in how to make their entire system more resilient and more robust. Some states, North Carolina being one of them, has been thinking about this for the last 5 years. And even though we now have the governor issued a mandate here about a month ago saying 50% of all vehicles sold in the state of North Carolina by 2030 would have to be electrical vehicles. In a quick analysis, we don't have the capacity here in the United States to make, if that was applied nationwide, to make the vehicles to fulfill that requirement. But then again, how are they going to get charged? And what's the drain on the existing power grids? And whether it is a renewable energy or it's natural gas, what are the power sources? I mean, this is a complex situation. The ecosystem has many moving parts, and I'm not yet convinced that everybody has thought through everything. I think we're eating around the edges, but we haven't come up with an entire total strategy like an integrated power grid throughout the United States. It's been proposed for 20 years, and we're still waiting for it. There are some integration, Tennessee to North Carolina to South Carolina, South Carolina to Virginia, as an example, but it needs to be more robust than that.
I also have a quick question. Hi, Professor Charles Edwards. This is Wei from University of California at Irvine. I spoke with Professor Edwards at TRB and later invited Professor Edwards to give a talk at UC Irvine. Pretty nice to meeting you, Professor Edwards.
Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, I have a quick question for the reason of this supply chain interruption. Is it the main driven force is the less workers are willing to drive, less truck drivers? Because we have the anticipatory orders before the pandemic, which means the demand is still high. So is it the reason of the supply goes down that make the whole supply chain crash?
So the level of anticipatory orders has been exacerbated by the rapid adoption of e-commerce or online shipping. In the past, if you went into a bricks and mortar environment, Macy's, Belk's, whatever, Nordstrom, the goods that you were making your selection on were already there. They were sitting on the rack, they were sitting on the shelves. So the orders had already been fulfilled. Now what's happening is we hover over items on websites. The algorithm is saying, that might end up being an order. And if enough people hover over the same item, we don't know this for sure, but there's indications, and there's been some patents put out, especially by Amazon. Those anticipatory but not firm confirmed orders are actually being translated into an order to a supplier. Over and above that, the $6 trillion that were pushed into the economy at the beginning and through the pandemic under the previous administration created a lot of cash that's been burning holes in the pockets of the average American citizen. And if one looks at the credit card usage, there was a report that came out today. We have gone back to the quote unquote bad old days of we're using credit cards at an unbelievable rate. And what we're doing is we're spending that cash, and it's primarily on goods, some services, including travel, but a lot of it is on goods. So the combination of the two is creating this. It's great for manufacturers in the United States and elsewhere around the world because they're getting all of these orders. The problem is that it's overwhelming the supply chain networks, that we're not ready for this unbelievable increase in the volumes.
I see. Thank you, Professor Charles.
Yeah, I mean the truck situation, the truck driver situation, that's part of the problem, but it is definitely not the only problem. I mean, another example of lack of manpower when the president announced, oh, we're going to open up the ports for 24/7. Well, okay, theoretically that makes a lot of sense. But especially crane operators, it typically takes about 6 months to train a crane operator that's going to be moving boxes on and off a vessel. Well, we haven't hit the 6-month mark, and who knows how many people actually signed up to say, yeah, I want to sit up on the crane and I want to move boxes back and forth. So, you can make that statement, but you better understand what the implications are and the requirements to achieve the end goal.
I see. So the main driven force is the explosion of the demand part for these supply chains.
That's becoming more and more evident. That's what's really creating this significant, I call it a meltdown. Maybe I'm being a little over dramatic, but the system is no longer moving the way it did, definitely pre-pandemic.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's pretty thought-provoking. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Could I elaborate on that if you don't mind?
Sure.
So, dealing with like I heard talk about the crane operators and everything. I have family that actually works in the port down here in like Port Everglades and all that.
Mhm.
Been working there for over 30 years. He is a crane operator, and the demand for his job, just because he has seniority, it's pretty easy. But like, there's no new people coming in to take his spot when he's gonna be done in a couple years. So,
Right.
jobs at the port are kind of like diminishing. Just he sees like less and less people.
Yep. And ports, Dominic, are stealing. Well, maybe poaching is a nicer term. Are poaching experienced either crane operators or whomever. And in fact, I know of one port, happens to be here in North Carolina, that goes down to Houston regularly and says, don't you want to live in North Carolina instead of Houston? And we'll pay you the same or even more. And our cost of living is less. And so they'll find experienced dock workers, primarily crane operators, high-tech workers, and they'll entice them to move to another port. And you're right, the overall pool, and that's where my statement about we need to be better in this country about exposing young people to the opportunities in the TDL business and generally in supply chain. I mean, typically the starting wages and salaries in TDL and supply chain are higher than in manufacturing. You don't need to have a 4-year degree, preferably to have a 2-year degree, which you can get from a wide variety of community colleges in all of the states. And these are good careers. And you can make a good wage. You have a wide variety of opportunities, but the nation as a whole isn't telling young people of these opportunities. And that's a shame. And that's part of my concern about will we ever get out from under this situation if we do not have people to fill the jobs that people my age are currently doing.
Yep. And then I actually had a question separate from the fact. I remember you were talking about places are just selling their land in order to make like warehouses for truckers and everything for them.
Mm-hmm.
Down here, I think we had the same kind of issue. There's a raceway in Jupiter called Palm Beach International Raceway, and they're giving
Right.
it up for sale. And Walmart, if I'm not mistaken, was trying to buy the entire land to just make it for a giant warehouse.
Yep.
So they're truckers.
Yep. I mean, if you look at, there is a cluster of distribution centers in the Allentown, Bethlehem Easton part of Pennsylvania, which is about 80 to 90 miles west of the New York, New Jersey conurbation. Buildings were being put up as recently as last year, and I think it's continuing, where speculators were buying the land, developers were building the buildings without a contract, and these are million square foot buildings, and they were selling them or leasing them out on long-term leases before they even completed the construction of the shell. There is a huge big development in Port St. Lucie in Florida. There's another huge development going in on the other side of the state, and that Tampa, St. Peter's, I think it's more in the Tampa area that I'm aware of. There's also developments in and around Orlando just because of its central location in the state. And a lot of those buildings, when they started, they did not necessarily have an owner lined up, but the developers knew that the demand was so high. I've been approached to advise on whether old tobacco warehouses, which are low ceilinged, not in great condition here in North Carolina, might not have an opportunity as a warehouse, be revitalized, some upfit as a warehouse. The nation is out of space. I mean, we're just totally out of space. And that's because all of these orders to suppliers. So the suppliers are holding on to the goods, but there was no real order for the goods in many cases. And so the product just sits in the warehouse. It does not move. It doesn't get to the consumer. And companies that bought the stuff in anticipation of selling it are potentially in a financial world of hurt. And what's that going to mean?
I had a question. One of your slides, I believe it's 14, showed the aerial images of the distribution centers. So you were saying it was about a 10-year difference between those are built to when the roads are capable of handling the traffic?
Yeah, you're talking about these ones, if you can see my cursor. Yeah, typically
Yes.
the process to come up with a road project until you either start or potentially, if you're really lucky, finish construction of a road is about 10 years. And that's in part because of the planning process, the financing process, and also the environmental processes. The environmental processes have, some administrations have said we should just dispense with that. I do not agree with that approach because we need to protect the environment, regardless of what we're talking about. But that doesn't necessarily delay a project that much. It may add an extra year to a project, but it's typically finding the money to actually build the roads. And if you don't collect the taxes, the federal government doesn't pay everything towards construction of roads. They pay about around 80% for an interstate, but it goes down rapidly. By the time you get to a local or community road, it's either up to the community or it's up to the state. And if the state doesn't have money, now Florida is an enviable position that they do have lots of money. There's a state that's north of there, not adjacent, but north of there, that their DOT got down to $2.39 in their entire piggy bank about 10 years ago, because they would not raise the taxes. And they finally did raise the taxes, and now they're trying to catch up after about 10, 15 years of being well behind. Some states have resources, many states don't, and that's the primary reason for the length of time it takes to build or add on to a road.
Yeah, and it seems like it's pretty heavy traffic, a lot of, I guess, impact on the roads with these heavy trucks and everything. So it's pretty interesting to see how quickly these are popping up and putting that demand on the roadways. So,
Yeah,
all right, thank you.
You're welcome. Welcome, David. Anybody else?
Any other question?
Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat from David again. If there is any focus on mitigating the environmental impacts from idling ships at ports that can alleviate health pollution, or is there at least discussions being made?
There's definitely discussions. There's definitely an awareness. There was a study done at Appalachian State University 3-4 years ago that's actually been corroborated at other universities. The 30 largest container vessels in the world cumulatively create more pollution than all of the cars, buses, and trucks in the entire world. 30 vessels versus millions and millions of road vehicles. And that's in part why the International Maritime Organization put out a requirement, I guess it became effective last July, that vessels needed to use low sulfur fuels. And there's a variety of different technologies, whether there's scrubbers, whether there's different types of fuels, et cetera. That was probably the most overt reaction to understanding what the impacts are of this. When it comes to road vehicles, the adoption of electrical vehicles will go a long way to mitigating the adverse environmental impacts, whether it's noise. Diesel engines are not exactly quiet, or it's the particulate emissions coming out of the stacks. there are other technologies that are being adopted in Europe and in primarily India, but also increasingly now in Asia, where you use digitalization. Trucks can only come to a gate, whether it's an airport gate or a port gate, if they have a reservation. And they usually have a 15 to 30 minute window in which they enter, they drop off the container. If they're doing a double turn, they pick up a container and they leave. And so there's less idling. And that is something that is not been adopted anywhere here in the United States. And there's a great opportunity to use existing truck technology, add in the digital platform, which has many benefits. I mean, CBP wants this because they'll have a better sense of what's on the ships, what's in each container. They can do their pre-screening. They can facilitate a faster move. The stevedoring companies, the terminal operators will know what's happening. They can plan their gangs so they have the right number of people at the right cranes, at the right yard areas. But we're woefully, in some cases, 30 years behind the rest of the world. And considering the technology, a lot of it actually uses American technology. We're just not applying it here in the United States. And it's just, and to me, it's inconceivable that we're not at least close behind other countries that are already using this technology, if not at the same level.
Yeah, it's I see all the pictures of the ships and the trucks, you know, that are all just idling, and that's a little bit scary. So it's good to know that at least they're looking into that and trying to reduce that. Thank you.
City of Los Angeles is really spending a lot of money in studying this and mapping it, understanding what the negative impacts, health impacts are on communities that primarily on the I-710 corridor, and trying to come up with systems to reduce the impacts. They can't go back and necessarily clean it all up, but they're probably head and shoulders ahead of everybody else in the United States, only because the impacts are so severe.
So the next question is from Jim. How much did COVID impact the problem?
So COVID accelerated the adoption of online trading. We couldn't go on a personal level, we couldn't go to the store. So we started to order online. And then we started to, for a variety of reasons, we didn't necessarily trust the image that was online. They're a lot better than they used to be. And we typically, if for a personal purchase, we tend to be tactile. Whether it's in the produce section of a grocery store, or it's in a clothing store, or even in a Lowe's or a Home Depot, we want to handle that item, whatever it is, to get a sense of its weight, its how it feels, whatever the case is. And so as a result, we tend to overorder. That generates returns if we buy everything that we hover over, because we're just unsure as to, will it fit, will it taste right, does it have all of the features that I want, whatever the case is. We, in 1 year, based on prognostications and reviews by especially one company called eMarketer, and you can find their blog. It comes out sometimes daily and sometimes weekly, but it only looks at the e-market environment. They, in one of the recent reports I've seen, and they're refining this, believe that we compressed 5 years of growth into 1 year, and we're not going back. Now, that doesn't mean that we're only ever going to be buying and selling online. It will always be a proportion of the total, maybe 30%, maybe 40%. The jury is out on that. But that accelerated, or COVID accelerated that employment of that form of purchasing, both for business to consumer, but also business to business. And business to business is actually, in some companies have estimated, it can be 2 to 3 times the volume of business to consumer. And so this is happening just in individual transactions. This is happening in corporate transactions.
So I have also here a few questions in the chat. Do you want us to continue the session, or should I pick 1 or 2 more questions and then end up the webinar? Dr. Kaiser, how do you want us to proceed? And Mr. Edwards, if...
I know that you've got other things to do in your
I'm
class.
totally agree with that. If you are okay with that, then I can go over all of the questions. So
yeah, I whatever makes sense for you, Evangelos. So.
Okay, let's have another 1 or 2 questions. Okay, and I think that's it. We can communicate offline. But also, it's one question: what is Charles' communication? Do you have this in the PowerPoint?
Yes,
Somebody
I already sent it. Dacia already has it.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Okay, another 1 or 2 questions maximum. Okay.
Okay, yeah. So I have 2 questions from Gary. He says that you have stated the issue of the supply chain shipping. What actionable item you would recommend to ease the issue? And then he would like to know your thought on autonomous freight corridors.
Oh, okay. So if I were king, I would stop all orders right now. I would not allow any company to order anything new unless they were absolutely out of stock, because until such time as we can slow the importation of products in, many of which are just sitting in warehouses being unsold, we're never really going to be able to clear out the system. But I can't do that. We live in a democracy. We live in a capitalist environment. We don't live in a socialist or communist command economy. So I can't do that. I do know that there are some companies that are looking at their full warehouses, looking at the cash that is locked up in that inventory and saying, I can't afford this, and they are starting to self-correct. And so there are companies here in the United States that are starting to significantly reduce their imports. As more and more companies come to the realization that financially they cannot survive, or are going to have their financial environment imperiled, and then start to slow down and significantly reduce orders, this problem is just not going to go away. It may shift from sector to sector, but cumulatively, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And the other one was autonomous corridors. Is that the question, Fazia?
Yes, your thought on autonomous freight corridors.
Okay, so if that means the use of autonomous vehicles to move product from one point to another, I'm going to answer the question if my presumption of what the question is, if that's what the question is. Yes, there's lots of opportunities. Again, it's going to require, the technology is basically already here. I mean, there are truck operations that are now routinely operating on I-10 from, I think it's primarily from El Paso into Arizona. These are unmanned tractor trailers, and they're running the service loaded. These are not tests. Well, it's a quasi-test, but they're actually moving revenue product up and down I-10. I-10, if you've ever been through New Mexico, there's not a lot there. There's not a lot of interchanges. There's not a lot of communities. And so it's a relatively safe environment in which to operate vehicles. We actually operated autonomous vehicles here in the Triangle part of North Carolina, and we've got over 1 million people, and highly used routes. So it's available. The problem is not the technology. The regulations, whether it's at state or federal level, are behind the technology. And more importantly, the insurance companies are still trying to grapple with, what do autonomous vehicles mean? What are the responsibilities of the operator of that vehicle? Yes, there's no driver, but that truck is owned by somebody, is controlled by somebody. And what happens if some person decides to do a brake check on an automated vehicle? It's bad enough if there's a driver in the cab. So the insurance and the regulatory components of the adoption of autonomous vehicles, unless they're in very tightly controlled environments, that's what's going to delay, in my estimation, that's what's going to delay the adoption of automated vehicles.
Thank you. I think we have one last question that you can answer before we end the session. So it's
Sure.
from Brian. Even though it's still going to take a while, does a year of freight like of 2022 call for a definitive push in automated freight trucks for the supply chain?
We will get to automated freight movements. If nothing else, I don't see the lack of available drivers. When Dominique was talking about his family that worked down at the port of Everglades, who's coming behind to fill the slots, whether it's crane operators or whatever. I don't think we're going to overcome that. And I think that there's a lot of benefits, operational benefits of having automated vehicles. I'm just not sure of the true rate of adoption of automated vehicles. Electrical vehicles, totally different. There's still a driver behind the wheel. But purely automated vehicles, there's a lot of issues, both regulatory and insurance, and just perceptual. I worked on a project at NC State about this, and there's a significant proportion of the American populace, and I would expect this is worldwide, that are just not comfortable of driving on a highway and you've got 100,000-pound rig, weight of the truck, tractor trailer, and the goods, that's right beside you, moving at 60, 70 miles per hour. And so there's got to be a lot of education as well as regulatory and insurance work before they're widely adopted.
Thank you so much, Mr. Edwards, for this very interesting webinar.